Awesome. Welcome, everyone. This special Livepeer community call is now being live streamed on livepeer.org/TV. So welcome to everyone joining us there, and welcome to everyone in this Zoom session. Very excited to have two special blockchain expert guests with us today to talk about the Ethereum Layer 2 landscape, probably the most exciting topic in blockchain today, arguably. And then specifically, we'll be talking about what the landscape means for Livepeer and the current Confluence protocol upgrade. Super excited that DCBuilder has joined us on the call from somewhere in Europe. DC, where are you?
And so I'm currently based in the Czech Republic. So, yep, joining in from Eastern Czech Republic.
Nice. And Yondon Fu is with us, the Director of Protocol Engineering at Livepeer in New York.
Hello, good to see everyone.
Great. I think I'm the only one visible. I don't see anyone else with their video on. So DCBuilder is a blockchain researcher and developer at Moralis. And DC, maybe we'll have you just give a little bit of an intro on what Moralis is for folks who may not know, and a little bit about your background as well. And you published an amazing Mirror article less than 2 weeks ago that provided an incredibly comprehensive overview of the layer 2 landscape and scaling solutions available to projects. And I actually posted that in our community Discord, in our community governance channel a couple weeks ago. I know some people have seen it. I know Yondon's read it. So really excited to have you give an overview of that for anyone on the call who may not have read it. And we have, Yondon on the call, who is the lead drafter of the Confluence protocol update proposal, which is going through our formal Livepeer improvement proposal governance process. And we are currently in the draft stage of the LIP process. So Yondon has done just an amazing job being transparent with the community. Mute people. Folks, if you're joining, if you could just mute yourselves, that'd be awesome. Otherwise, I will do that. So we are in the draft LIP phase for Confluence. Yondon has provided a ton of content and information to the community via the forum and in a recent Mirror blog post last week, just updating on the current thinking with regards to just the decision-making framework for contemplating layer 2s. And this call, just to situate it in the context of the governance process, is really meant to get the community's feedback in this draft LIP stage so that Yondon and the core team can make the necessary changes to reflect your input. So that was why we decided to have this call, was have an expert who's been looking at the landscape at a high level, and Yondon, who can speak specifically to the proposals for Livepeer, and for you guys to just ask questions in an open format. So that's that. DC, do you want to start?
Yep. So you said that I should start with introducing Moralis. So Moralis is a Web3 development platform that allows developers to not worry about building a backend. Usually you have to set up RPC nodes to listen to the blockchain, but it's much better to just use Moralis, which offers an SDK and several APIs, which allow you to just fetch data from the blockchain, which is queryable with SQL. So it's like much easier for building blockchain applications instead of building all the infrastructure from scratch. So what I do there is blockchain research, which is just an overall, like, looking into everything that's happening within crypto, DeFi, blockchain development, different L2s, but anything that you can think of that belongs into these categories, and writing about it. And so part of my job is just having a general overview of everything that's going on. And so that's how I stumbled upon L2s, because it's a very obvious issue that Ethereum has currently, which is that the fees are so high that it makes it unable, or it makes it very hard to use if you don't have a lot of capital. And so it's a no-brainer that we need to scale in order to actually make all of the possibilities and all of the use cases that we want to make on blockchain possible. And so that's why L2s were created, in order to scale Ethereum. So I'll give a short introduction into my article that I wrote on Mirror. It's called the Ultimate Guide to L2s on Ethereum. It's published on Mirror under DCBuilder.eth, which is my public ENS. And so yeah, it's a short overview, or it's not really a short overview. It's an overview of the entire landscape of L2s. It gives a background explanation on how L2s came to be and what types of L2s exist out there, what different types of technologies they use to scale, what is and what is not considered an L2, different infrastructures that several projects that are being deployed use, just several tools to measure how much TVL they have, how much usage they have, liquidity solutions. There's a rising concern that there is going to be fragmented liquidity across L2s. And so yeah, just a generic overview of everything from optimistic rollups, zero knowledge rollups, and a lot of resources to learn more about everything in the L2 space. Just like a comprehensive aggregation of resources in order to learn more about how L2s work. Yep.
Amazing. And I just posted the link to your article in the chat if folks haven't had a chance to read it yet.
Yep. Good.
Hey, just yeah, thanks for giving that overview, DC. I had a quick thought on maybe how we could frame the conversation going forward, if you're up for it, because I know that the article that you wrote was very comprehensive, but I'm not sure what the background of everyone on the call is, but maybe it'd be helpful if we can start off with maybe talking a little bit about what we mean by the term L2s, because I think the rest of this call is going to really focus on that category of scaling solution, right? So maybe we can start by just mentioning what we mean by the term L2s and how they might be different from, say, sidechains, bridge to Ethereum, or just other layer ones. Do you think that might be a good place to start?
Yep, sure. So L2s, in short, L2 just stands for it's a term that's used to divide different parts of the Ethereum tech stack, or the Ethereum stack as a whole. So the L1 is the settlement layer, aka Ethereum mainnet, where all transactions are executed and consensus is done on all of those transactions. L2 just means the execution layer. So the execution layer is where those transactions are actually run. Currently, the L1 and the L2 are the same because the EVM runs on the mainnet, and that's where all the transactions get bundled, or most of them. And so in our term, the execution layer is going to become is going to be fragmented into separate networks where these transactions are going to be run. And these networks inherit the same security guarantees and decentralization that Ethereum has. They're fully permissionless and decentralized. And by using cryptography, they're able to settle transactions on Ethereum. And what these networks do is that, since they don't have to worry about consensus, it's much easier to just set up a validator node, which is fully permissionless and trustless. It isn't maintained by anyone. And these servers are able to concurrently run different transactions and bundle them and verify that all the transitions, or all the transactions, are valid within the network. And once they verify this, they submit a proof to the Ethereum L1, where there's a verifier smart contract, and with the power of cryptography, if all the transactions are valid, these transactions are committed into the Ethereum L1, or the Ethereum mainnet. So that's sort of what I mean by L2s. It's a scaling solution, or a scaling network, which inherits the security guarantees and decentralization of Ethereum, and is fully permissionless and trustless, meaning that there's no added risk. It's the same as transacting on Ethereum L1. It's just more scalable and powerful overall, and provides a better user experience for users.
Yeah, that last bit might be a good segue into a follow-up, which is clearly a lot of people in the blockchain space care about the costs that are incurred by users, And I think a very natural instinct someone might have is they might point to a sidechain like XDAI or a sidechain like the current one implemented on Polygon, although Polygon has an updated roadmap, which will change things up a little bit, but they might point at those solutions today and say, oh, well, those blockchains, the transaction costs are substantially lower than even some of the L2s that are out right now. So what would your reaction be to that comment? And what do you think some of the kind of unsaid dangers of that thinking are for someone that is kind of looking to reduce the transaction costs of users?
Yeah, there's always a compromise, right? If you want to use something like XDAI or Polygon POS, those are side chains, meaning that they do not inherit Ethereum security. What I mean by Ethereum security is that if the network were to go dark by a bug or validators attacking the network or whatnot, it would imply that the network and all of its capital inside would be locked forever or would not be accessible by users. You would not be able to withdraw unless the validators kickstarted the network again with the same state. There's some different implementations for XDAI and Polygon POS. Polygon POS is technically not a sidechain, it's a commit chain, and validators are on Ethereum L1. They have like a simple, like there's various different implementations of these solutions, but long story short is that they do not inherit Ethereum security, which for critical infrastructure, like for example, Livepeer, it would be a very bad or even like catastrophic event to happen if something went wrong in the network it's deployed on, and all of the balances of the validators and various actors within the network would go down without them being able to retrieve their funds or anything else that's critical infrastructure that would go down. And so L2s, if an L2 network goes down, it's the same thing as the fund. It's the same as if the funds were on L1, because the funds are locked in a smart contract bridge, which is not a multisig. It's just a smart contract, which is permissionless and trustless. And whenever there's a so-called escape hatch. And so if the network were to go down, you can always withdraw your funds according to the latest state snapshot that was published onto the L1. So the latest proof, the latest cryptographic proof, has a bundle of all the state that the network had, and people can withdraw from the smart contract according to the latest snapshot that was taken. And so that's what makes L2s secure and decentralized, and do not add added risk to smart contracts that are deployed on them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just to add a little more color on, I guess, because you brought up the Livepeer example, the way that I like to think about it is that the core service that Livepeer provides today is video infrastructure. And we know that video developers rely very heavily on just extreme levels of uptime, where there's like a very high bar in terms of what you need in order to build an app in terms of uptime. And because the Livepeer network, we wanted to have the most uptime as possible and have be as performant and reliable as possible, because it's built off of a blockchain that is required for things such as payment settlement. The uptime of the Livepeer network is necessarily then correlated and related to the uptime of the underlying blockchain network as well. So I think that's an interesting relationship to focus in on, where we do very much care about what the expected uptime and the potential risks of downtime on any given blockchain network that the Livepeer network is built on top of, because any compromise there necessarily results in degradation of service or maybe even prolonged downtime of the network, which would be bad for video infrastructure for developers. So just wanted to add that quick point there.
Yeah, makes a lot of makes a very whole the explanation. Yeah. So
I'm just wondering if at this point, do you want to kind of set the stage for, where we're at in our thinking around layer 2 scaling strategies, and just kind of start to dig into how you've been thinking about positioning the Livepeer protocol in this landscape?
Sure. So yeah, I can do that, and maybe for each like individual area, we can kind of open it up as well, because I think they're definitely not small areas. So I would I would split up kind of like the biggest categories for Livepeer from a design thinking standpoint thus far as being one, how do we in the short term bring transaction cost savings to the users without sacrificing on security and resiliency of the underlying blockchain network, which we were just talking about. So that's one. In the short term, we know that gas fees are painful on layer 1 Ethereum. How can we make immediate big leaps there? So that's one category. And then the other category is at the same time, we know that this scaling landscape is so dynamic and so fast moving and constantly evolving. For anyone that's read DC's article, I know DC gave a very brief overview, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. And there's so many projects working on interesting technological innovations. People might be familiar with the optimistic rollup flavor of scaling, the ZK rollup flavor of scaling, and there's just so much there. But the timelines for all these different projects are different, where we've seen a number of these projects and solutions come to market in the last couple of months, but some of these other solutions are just coming to market in the next few months. And that's really just the alpha stage, right? So it's not even an apples to apples comparison when you say like, oh, is this comparable to layer 1 Ethereum? Because the lifespan of these solutions is just so different. So with all that being said, I think it's just clear that there's a lot of important innovation happening here, but we just said that we want to make some short-term scaling gains. So given that we want to make some short-term scaling gains, what are the implications on the project and the evolution of the protocol as the scaling landscape continues to evolve? How will the protocol adapt to scaling updates and scaling innovations as they come around? And can there be a bigger picture strategy that the short-term solution that was the first focus can fit into, so that the protocol can continue to bring cost savings to users over time, as opposed to just saying at this point in time, this is like the end solution that's going to fix everything. So I'd say those are like the two categories that we've been focused on from a design thinking standpoint. One is more short-term oriented, and the other is trying to fit that short-term solution into a bigger picture, maybe longer-term strategy. So maybe I'd start with that, and I can go into either more, but maybe I'll pause there in case we want to use that as a stopping point.
That's super helpful. And I feel like a lot of times when people talk about L2 migration, there can be an assumption that it's this one-shot deal. And I think it's really great to highlight that, you know, this is a long-term game and there are decisions and strategies to be made in the short term while, you know, keeping an eye on the evolving landscape. So Yondon, you have proposed Arbitrum as a short-term solution in the context of this longer-term planning strategy. And I'm wondering if both you and DC can kind of speak to the benefits that Arbitrum does provide today, and kind of why that is a good short-term decision and what that means over the long term.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about some of the rationale for Arbitrum, but in terms of just like presenting the overview of Arbitrum, DC, maybe you want to take that since you gave a pretty good description in your post.
Yeah, sure. I'll take that one. So basically, there's So why Arbitrum, right? Currently, there's many solutions coming to market. Each of them have different levels of maturity, and so the problem with many solutions is that they're either in a beta phase or they have permissionless deployments, meaning that you need to be whitelisted by the project in order to deploy your smart contracts. So if you take these two criterion in mind, the two that come up currently that are deployed live and are fairly easy to deploy on are Arbitrum and Optimism. So Optimism is currently permissioned, meaning that you cannot deploy smart contract without talking to the team and getting whitelisted. This will of course change as the platform leaves its beta phase. But Arbitrum, it's still in its beta phase, but it's publicly available. So anyone can deploy smart contracts on top of the platform without having to get whitelisted. And so this is one of the rationale for why using optimistic rollups currently, because zero knowledge rollups or zero knowledge rollup technology is still like 3 to 8 months away from live deployment. There's people like ZK Sync starting to launch their 2.0 fully EVM compatible ZK rollup later this year, but they will still be testing a lot of things. Many new projects will kick in. Also Starknet, which is Starkware's fully EVM compatible rollup, will also launch later in November for their alpha testnet or their alpha mainnet, but it will be relaunched later. And so yeah, these solutions will come to market a little bit later and won't have the infrastructure maturity that is needed for hosting something like Livepeer. And so if you want users to have a seamless experience and do not have to worry about, so what block explorer do I use to find transactions, or does it work with my MetaMask, or is it easy to work with the technology to actually deploy the Livepeer infrastructure on top of that? And so currently, if we take into account the levels of maturity of all these different solutions, Arbitrum and some other networks that are based on optimistic rollups are sort of preferred by many projects. Yep.
Yeah, maybe to just stop off at the ZK rollup point briefly. I think this was mentioned in your post, and I also I had shared a post recently talking specifically about proposed scaling strategy for Livepeer that I just shared a link in the chat. So I think in both your post and my post, we did highlight that if you zoom out and look at a longer term time horizon, the technology that is coming with ZK rollups is incredibly powerful. And as it evolves and as it becomes mature, there's a very good chance that that category is going to become more and more preferred. But to your point, it's still a little bit early. And while a lot of those solutions are coming to the market in the next couple of months, they're all going to be at this alpha stage. And I actually think something that's worthwhile considering, in addition to your point around the surrounding infrastructure around these rollups, where is there a block explorer? Is there a Etherscan equivalent? As a user, am I able to get easy visibility into what's happening on in this blockchain? I think an additional thing worth noting there is also developer comfort, where I think the reality is that, especially at this early stage, because these zero knowledge proof rollups rely on some pretty cutting edge new cryptography, it's not as straightforward, say, a developer to kind of like just go into that open source code and try to understand what's happening, which might actually be required at an alpha stage, right? I'm sure any open source developer on this call is used to just going into the code themselves if they're not sure what's happening or if they suspect something might be wrong. But there's a much bigger hurdle when we talk about anything ZKP related, whilst for something like Optimism and Arbitrum, at least in the short term, I think it is a little more developer accessible if you need to understand what's happening. And I think that also contributes to like comfort level and being able to design solutions because you have confidence and an understanding of what you're running. I think that could totally change, maybe even soon. But I think that's something additional I think is worth taking into consideration in addition to the good points you had about infrastructure.
Yeah, I very much agree with that.
Cool. I just want to remind and invite everyone on the call to raise your hand or type a question in the chat to chime in with questions for Yondon and DC.
Yeah, so I'm definitely happy to get into the Arbitrum rationale a little more momentarily, but I actually noticed that there was a point raised in the Livepeer Discord maybe over the weekend or last week that might be useful to stop, pause on for a moment, which is, I think someone provided a link to, I think it's L2fees.info, which is a site that compares the relative transaction costs for just a regular old, I think, ETH transfer on different L2s and compares them to Ethereum. And someone did note that oh, Arbitrum is cheaper than, well, I think it was the case for both Arbitrum and Optimism. Both of these are cheaper than Ethereum, but definitely not multiple magnitudes cheaper than Ethereum. And while the number was lower, it didn't look significantly lower. So I think they flagged that, and there was some conversation or in Discord around why that is, but maybe we can talk about that for a moment. And DC, I don't know if you want to talk at all about this question of why aren't Arbitrum and Optimism
Yeah,
that cheap right now?
Yeah, I can expand on that for sure. So do you want me to talk more about this, or?
Yeah, I think it might be helpful just to frame
right.
things for people.
Yeah, so currently optimistic rollups are still immature compared to the Ethereum stack. So this is not the full level of scalability that optimistic rollups are able to provide. There are still updates being rolled out. Optimism recently launched their OVM 2.0 upgrade, which will also significantly lower costs over the long term. And Arbitrum is launching Arbitrum Nitro soon, which will also bring down costs. Well, the problem currently with optimistic rollups is that they are still in guardrail mode, meaning that they do have some elements of centralization and some limitations to what they're able to do. So the validators are not running at full capacity. So this is just to prevent something bad happening. And if something were to happen, it's so that the team is able to intervene without having to go through the governance process, which takes a long time. And so, yeah, currently is why it's still a 10x improvement over Ethereum mainnet. So if it to send ETH is like a few cents, and to do a swap, it's anywhere from $4 to $5 if you want to do a swap on Uniswap for Arbitrum or Optimism, compared to like $50 on average, which is on Ethereum mainnet, and worse if gas spikes. And so, yeah, it's at least anywhere from a 10x to 30x improvement currently. But as also another feature of L2s is that the more users you have on an L2 and the more transactions you have coming in, the fees that are needed to be paid to Ethereum mainnet for settling these cryptographic proofs is going to get distributed across a wider amount of transactions. And so the cost per transaction is going to be lowered, right? So once you have more users and these guardrails are lifted, you will still experience like a 2 to 3x improvement or so on the gas fees that the users actually will pay. And a big part of this, I think, will be once these layer 2s launch liquidity mining on these platforms. It's a speculation, but it's most likely that many of these L2s will launch tokens, either for governance of the network or for just various incentivizations within the network. And if these tokens were to launch for these L2s, and if you couple this with incentives from different platforms that are onboarding, so let's say that Livepeer has incentives on Arbitrum for users to provide liquidity, this would bring a huge mass of users onto the L2 because you have liquidity mining rewards or staking rewards on these L2s. And once you bring the users, the fees for everyone become lower gradually. And so that's sort of like the reasoning why the fees are still a bit higher than you'd expect for an L2 solution, or that because there's certain levels or certain fees that are advertised, like what's the capability of these to have. So sub-dollar fees, it's usually what people advertise within these L2s. And so, yeah, it's just a matter of time until this scales out to this level in the midterm.
Yeah, really interesting points there. Maybe we can stop over briefly on the guardrails bit. So I had like 2 follow-up questions there. One was, so based on your description, the fact that these guardrails are in place right now should imply that there's no technological advancements that need to be made by, say, the Arbitrum team or the Optimism team in order to kind of increase throughput of their chain, therefore bringing the fees down. It really just requires them to like change a configuration to lift that cap on, say, the nodes that they're running or the sequencer that they're running, but they're just choosing to keep that cap right now for safety purposes. But if they wanted to lift that cap, there's no major technological update that they need to make. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding of it. Optimism did release its OVM 2.0 upgrade, but Arbitrum hasn't released its Arbitrum Nitro upgrade yet. And so Arbitrum Nitro will lower down the cost as the technological upgrade to the to the infrastructure itself. But there are also guardrails on the existing infrastructure, and these changes are fairly seamless. It just might happen that the network will be down for like 2 hours, like Optimism was. Optimism was actually down for 1 hour instead of the 2 hours that were advertised. And so, yeah, this is sort of like the limitations. To my understanding, it's just the change in configuration. But for Arbitrum, they are still going to implement one technological upgrade and then lift the guardrails.
Right,
Yep.
right. That makes sense. And then the next bit that I wanted to follow up on was it's pretty interesting how this guardrail or the throttling of the number of transactions is actually something that makes things more expensive. That might actually be counterintuitive maybe to some people, where you would imagine like, oh, if there's less stuff happening, things would be cheaper. But in this case, it's actually, if there's more stuff happening, it's cheaper. And you had a brief point about how like, oh, the cost is spread amongst more transactions. And for those that are more technically inclined on the call, they might be familiar with how the cost structure of transactions on L2s and like the difference between like L1 call data cost and L2 execution cost. But do you want to maybe describe that a little more to kind of provide a little more intuition around why more stuff happening actually makes things cheaper?
Yeah, there's an asymmetric relationship for L2 gas cost and L1 submissions. So the fact is that if you add twice the amount into a rollup, like twice the amount of transactions into a rollup, it will only add 1 unit of work more into the, like 1 times the unit of work into the actual validator that's on chain on L1. So for every doubling, you only add 1 unit. So for every like quadratic implementation or adding, you only add linear costs into the submission of the proof onto the L1. And so whenever these gas fees or when these transactions are taken, or you have more transactions on the network, the cost of submitting the proof does not change. It's almost the same. It's just a little bit more. It scales linearly, whereas you can scale the transactions quadratically. And so if you scale a lot, if you have a lot of transactions happening on the network, these fees will be spread out more evenly across all these different transactions without adding cost to the submissions of the proof, because these proofs need to be submitted either way. And so you can consider them as half full. If you submit something that's half full, it's still half full. You have to pay for the same proof. But if you have it fully, if the block space is full and has all of these transactions coming in, it doesn't add cost to submitting the same proof for it onto the mainnet. And so that's where the main change in the UX happens. That once you have more transactions, the fees are lower overall per transaction.
Yeah, thanks for going through that. I thought it'd be worthwhile just to cover that momentarily, because it's not the most intuitive unless someone has been spending time taking a look at L2s all the time.
Awesome. I don't see any questions in the chat. Just a reminder to people, please feel free to ask questions. Yondon, as part of this draft LIP phase for Confluence, you had a couple of research questions that you wanted to put to the community for feedback as we evolve the proposal. Do you want to just remind people what those kind of key questions are that you're thinking about from a research perspective right now? And maybe you and DC can chat about that.
Sure. So I think now is just worthwhile referencing I think I might have, I shared the post in the chat already. So just for a little bit of background for anyone that hasn't seen that post, the forum post describes kind of like a bigger picture scaling strategy for the Livepeer protocol. And it takes into account those two core ideas I mentioned at the beginning. One, what are the short-term things that we can do to get cost savings? And two, what are the implications of this evolving blockchain landscape? And is there a way that we can make the short-term decision part of a framework that also continues to allow the protocol to evolve as scaling evolves as well? So in that document, what I described was first, the different approaches. I did mention that there are different approaches to call it like multi-chain scaling. So anyone that has been participating in the DeFi ecosystem these days knows that a lot of projects are already adopting L2s, but the way that they adopt L2s is a little bit different depending on the project. So I think there is this great MakerDAO article that I linked to in my forum post that describes some of the available options. Just going down the list, one option is you create your own blockchain. So forget about building on top of Ethereum. You move all the activity for your protocol into its own blockchain. An example of this is Compound Cash. So the Compound team is working on the Compound Cash blockchain. Another example is choosing a specific rollup or a specific blockchain or scaling solution. And an example of that is Synthetics. So Synthetics has chosen to use Optimism, and they've been working on this roadmap in order to migrate to Optimism, but they're not planning, at least immediately, on expanding to multiple other chains. They're really just focused on Optimism. And then the last of the couple are actually being multi-chain. So Uniswap is a great example here. Uniswap exists on L1 Ethereum. Uniswap exists on Optimism. Uniswap exists on Arbitrum. So there's different strategies. There's really no one size fits all strategy. And when we were thinking about what should the strategy be for Livepeer, I think for a protocol like Livepeer, and I'll use the general categorization of work protocols, where a work protocol consists of various on-chain incentives such as staking and fees, but also consist of this off-chain network of nodes that then communicate with those contracts in order to claim rewards, settle payments. And really the meat of the activity is happening on the off-chain node network. So these work protocols have this extra really big component, which is all these off-chain nodes that are connected to the contracts. So I think that's something that makes Livepeer and this category of work protocols a little bit unique when you start considering scaling strategies, because not only do you have to worry about, say, liquidity fragmentation, like what happens if you end up with tokens here, tokens here, tokens here. You also have a question of like, well, what happens to all this node infrastructure that our people are running that currently is pointed to L1 Ethereum, and tomorrow, if you want to expand to another chain, what do you do about that? Is that a big problem? Is that an insurmountable problem? And so that was a big factor in the thinking here. And in the rest of the post, basically what I describe is, perhaps one way that you can have like a more generalized scaling strategy that doesn't preclude the ability for you to take advantage of other scaling solutions in the future. Like, let's say we're going with Arbitrum today. Best case scenario, Arbitrum continues scaling and the team is already doing a fantastic job. But let's say in the future, like ZK rollups really do dominate, and there's just certain things technologically that you can do there in order to push costs down that maybe the other projects are not able to do for whatever reason. Who knows? So let's say that's the scenario. We don't want to end up in a case where, well, we can't push down transaction costs any lower. So a way to accommodate for that was described in the post was just being more flexible with user-initiated migrations. So today we have a set of contracts that are deployed on layer 1 Ethereum that supports staking, that supports payment settlement, and we have a bunch of off-chain nodes pointed at those contracts. If we want to move to Arbitrum, one process that's described there is you can take your stake that is on L1 Ethereum and create a system where you can seamlessly migrate that into a contract on Arbitrum. And at the end of that transaction, you have stake on Arbitrum and you no longer have stake on L1 Ethereum. And anyone can choose to do that by signing a message or submitting a transaction. And the nice part here is that it's sort of like teleporting your stake from one contract to another. And then you start earning rewards and fees off of that stake on L2, on Arbitrum, instead of on L1. And in theory, that's a cheaper process than what you currently have to go through today on L1. But then the question becomes, well, if people are migrating over time, what happens to all this node infrastructure? Is it pointed to L1 Ethereum? Is it pointed to L2 Ethereum or L2 Arbitrum? And this is actually like a big concern, right? Because at the end of the day, the service offered by the network is dependent on the amount of capacity available on the network. So if you simply said, oh, I am only going to connect to the Arbitrum contracts if not a sufficient amount of capacity is migrated over within a very short period of time, that could potentially lead to degradation of service, insufficient capacity, maybe even network downtime. And a potential workaround to that is to basically have a smoother transition here, where you can actually connect to both contracts, both chains, and you're actually able to continue leveraging capacity on L1 before it migrates over to L2. And then over a longer period of time, if the transition goes well and everyone is really excited about L2 because of all the cost savings, maybe you never even have to rely on anything on L1 yet. But this is really around the transition period, making sure that there aren't gigantic bumps in the road that cause major disruptions, just so that you can kind of naturally and gradually move over to L2, as opposed to seeing a huge drop off in capacity on the network because you quote unquote only support L2. So that's a little bit of the framing. I know that it took me a little bit to get through that, but onto the actual questions we wanted to pose to the community. And the two that I posed in that forum post, one was, so I just described this whole process for getting some cost savings in the short term by immediately choosing an L2, such as Arbitrum, that we can take advantage of. But maybe you're gonna need another migration in the future. It's hard to say. One question I posed was, how do people feel about the potential requirement to migrate again in the future and go through another user-initiated migration process versus, say, just waiting longer and not doing anything in the short term? So that was one question. The second question that I posed was has to do with incentives. So with protocol inflation, for anyone that's been in the Livepeer community, there's new LPT that's minted every day that's rewarded to orchestrators that provide service on the network. Well, if we migrate to an L2, there's a question of, well, should there only be protocol inflation on L2, such that you need to stake on L2 in order to earn any rewards, and then disable protocol inflation completely on L1? Should there be a sort of hybrid approach where maybe you gradually decrease inflation on L1 while you gradually increase inflation on L2? And there's other possibilities as well, but the general question is, how should protocol inflation be handled? Should it be a one-shot binary switch where everything goes to L2, or should there be a more gradual process? So that was the second question that I posed, and there have been some great commentary in the forum post already that, yeah, people have engaged with. So those are the two questions, and yeah.
Cool. So the first question is wait or act now. If you can summarize the first question again.
Yeah, I would summarize it as, would you prefer to wait to see how some of these solutions develop to avoid having to do, say, another migration in the future? Or would you prefer to take advantage of cost savings immediately, migrate immediately, with the possibility of additional migrations in the future?
Got it. And the second one was clear. How should protocol inflation be handled? So yeah, I think we've had a couple of responses to those questions in the forum already. DC, I want to give you a chance to respond to those as a guest member of our community today.
To the question that was just posed by Yondon.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, either scale now or wait for the future. The thing is that even if you have different L2 solutions that are going to be preferred in the future and are either not yet live or will be live in the near future, the thing is that these solutions use fairly similar technology. The only main distinction is either if you're an optimistic rollup or a ZK rollup. They will use some different variations of these two. But once you're in an L2, it's much easier to migrate across L2s because the costs are simple. They're not as big. Even if you're on a different L2, you could migrate those contracts to another L2 if you wanted, and migrate the liquidity through bridges, which are being developed. There's bridges like Hop Protocol or Connext, which are currently, they do have some elements of centralization, but over time, they will become fully permissionless and decentralized. And so, yeah, like these migrations, along with some new liquidity infrastructure that's being built out and communication infrastructure across different rollups will enable just a cross L2 world that's completely seamless and will not be able to be discerned by users. So users eventually will be able to use different protocols from an application without knowing on which rollup they live. Also, there's the Ethereum proof of stake upgrade, which will eventually have data sharding. So once you have proof of stake, that's the main feature that you need in order to have data sharding. And so data sharding will come a little bit later, but once you have sharded execution on the Ethereum mainnet, there will be rollups that are on different shards, and all of this infrastructure, it's pretty complex, but on a high level, users won't ever notice the intricacies of these things. So personally, I'm in favor in scaling now and migrating later because it's a much easier step. And it's always you always have some form of compromise. It may be a solution that's better in the short term and worse in the long term because you need to do more work, but it also, these costs may be worth it as well, because the saving costs that users have in the medium term, because I feel the pain of many users which want to swap like $200 from ETH to DAI, but they will lose $50 of their hard-earned profits just for the fee of swapping it. And then they even have to send it to an exchange if they want to cash out. And so, yeah, I think that it's better to lead as an example and encourage other protocols to migrate as well, to build this better infrastructure that's runs on these rollups and that take advantage of cryptography in order to scale without compromising security and decentralization like other L1s, i.e. Solana, Phantom, Avalanche, or other drawbacks that are taken by others. Yep.
Yeah, it was an interesting point that you made about the benefits of just like being on L2 as a default, as opposed to being on L1 as a default, even if, say, the L2 that you're on does not have as much transaction cost savings as another solution that comes into the market in like 3 to 6 months. And I think that's actually really interesting to highlight because of not only the connectivity with the cheaper connectivity with other chains and other L2s from being on L2 already, but I think there is also something to be said about just rollups and L2 teams that are building the infrastructure for those projects, just to have the flexibility from a development velocity standpoint to move faster than, say, anyone that's a core developer on Ethereum, for good reason, right? Because Ethereum is the settlement layer and you just necessarily have more considerations there. But by being on L2 as a default, you as a project and protocol expose yourself to a higher likelihood of advancements in like a fixed period of time than, say, being on L1 as a default. So even if maybe you're not getting the best possible savings ever kind of as a default, if you just compare it to L1, you're going to see more, you're likely going to see a faster rate of improvement. So that's another point on it from my end.
Yep, sure. I'm going to briefly talk about a question that I saw. The question from Strykar, Do L2 solutions like Arbitrum enable higher TPS? And if so, by how much more? So I was just in the process of replying by text, but I'll also respond verbally. I also see Verisinumerous that has responded. So yeah, currently L2 solutions, they scale by lowering down the gas cost of transactions, meaning that to execute several different transactions, you consume less gas overall. And so that's what enables a lot more transactions per second, along with the fact that you don't have to worry about L1 consensus and you have immediate finality. The L2 sequencers pick up transactions in like anywhere from 50 to like 200 milliseconds. And so the confirmation times are like immediate. Whenever you're using an application on L2 and you hit submit transaction, the transaction picks up, or it's picked up by a sequencer almost immediately. And so if you couple these two facts, you can currently get up to like 10 to 50x scalability. And midterm is like 100x scalability from L2s alone. You also will have in the next year and a half, hopefully we have, if anything doesn't go wrong with Ethereum core development, we'll have data shards, which will also scale Ethereum by about a factor of 100x. And long-term, ZK rollups are expected to have around a million TPS million TPS by the end of the decade or so. And so if you couple the million transactions per second times the 100x scalability provided by data sharding, it's about 100 million x improvement over the current situation over the decade. And so, yeah, there was a good post by Tim Baiko, which is one of the Ethereum core development managers. And he said that Ethereum is going to scale at 10x each year for the next 4 years straight, And so that's sort of a good guiding expectance to have. So just basically L2s will allow for a 10x every year for the next 4-ish years if you couple it with the fact that Ethereum is going to have data sharding on the mainnet.
Awesome. DC, do you have any thoughts around the second question about how the Livepeer protocol inflation should be handled in the context of an L2 migration?
Yeah, so inflation is usually used to incentivize users and to give them rewards for performing certain actions. It's used to provide an incentive structure which gets some goals done sooner. And so these rewards are usually done for in the context of L2s. It's so that users are incentivized to migrate over, and so that they feel that what they're doing or their work they have to put into to migrate and to commit some of their funds to migrate their positions is somehow rewarded by the protocol itself. There's many protocols that are thinking about how to reward their users in a way that helps them migrate over to L2. There's talks in, for example, Uniswap governance into migrating the biggest liquidity pools into L2s by providing liquidity mining rewards from the treasury. That's one option. And so in the context of Livepeer, if Livepeer were to help users transition faster or have a good incentive for users to migrate over, it will be good to use inflation as part of that if it's agreed upon by the governance by the governance of the protocol. Yeah.
Yondon, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's generally a really good way to think about it. And I think there's been already a number of good points raised in the forum. I think Vera's had a good post about just leaning on inflation as like a strong incentive for people to move. So I agree with all those points. I suppose the main thing that I have on my mind, not disagreeing with having inflation on L2 at all. I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. But I think the main thing on my end is how we can avoid, say, how we can strike the right balance between incentivizing people to move, but also not incentivizing, say, a mad rush aping in type of behavior. where I think some of the downsides of the latter are that if the incentives are structured such that you really need to go as soon as possible with everybody else, then you run into potential issues such as, well, what happens if there's a gas spike during that time? Are you necessarily disadvantaging people that have a smaller amount of capital when gas prices are really high, and telling them, well, you got to move with everyone else. It doesn't matter if the gas price on Ethereum is 900 GWay, now is the time to move. So that's like, I think the main thing that I had in mind, where just trying to strike the right balance between, of course, we want to incentivize people to move, but also trying to avoid kind of mad rushes as well, just because I think there can be negative side effects and externalities of that as well.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk in general DeFi about liquidity mining and liquidity renting, because that's what it is. If people issue by issuing new tokens and rewarding people for providing liquidity in some protocols, you're effectively renting the liquidity, because once those liquidity mining rewards run out, in most cases, unless the utility is still so big that you still use the protocol without incentives, it sometimes leads to the fact that people just rush in to extract as much liquidity incentives or liquidity mining incentives as possible, and then exit. Meaning that if someone or if Livepeer were to rush this process, for example, and have very prolific rewards, it could happen that some outsiders that are not really interested in Livepeer would capture this opportunity by just taking a lot of their infrastructure, running it, exploiting all of this Livepeer rewards, and then leaving without ever touching Livepeer again. And so one mechanism that's used often is just vesting these rewards, meaning that you get these amounts of rewards, but they're spread out over time, and users are then like their alignments are more long term instead of just farming instantly. And yeah, that's one strategy. There's also people or protocols like Olympus DAO, where they, instead of doing liquidity mining, they have an innovative structure that makes them so as the protocol owns their own liquidity, and it allows for other people that own the liquidity of the token to be bonded into the protocol, but for a discount of the token. So let's say that Livepeer has a liquidity pool or staking pool somewhere, and if someone owns part of that staking, they could redeem their staking position for the token, and that will provide liquidity, self-owned liquidity for the protocol itself. So like there's different mechanisms that are adopted by current DeFi protocols. I do not know how well these structures would fit under the context of Livepeer. But yeah, like either you vest the rewards or you use some of these newer liquidity strategies that are being used here by Olympus DAO or people like Tokamak or some other innovative projects that do innovate upon this concept of liquidity mining in some degree.
Super fascinating. Olympus is like DeFi 2.0, I guess.
Yeah, that's sort of the name that's been adopted by the community. It's more than DeFi 2.0. It's more like DeFi 2021. It's just because like the former projects like Maker and Aave and all of these that were deployed in 2020 are still innovating fast. So it's unfair to call them a DeFi 1.0 or like older. It's just it's a new set of protocols which have new experiments that are trying to do something different. Yeah.
DC, just on curious, I'm cautious we are also over time. Before I follow up with the question, I just want to one more time invite members of the audience to ask questions. This has been such an exciting conversation. Yondon and DC, do you guys have a couple more minutes or?
Yeah, I'm fine.
I actually have to hop off, but
Great.
this was great, and great chatting as always, DC.
Yep. See you later.
Cool. We still have people can hop off. I think people are hopping off. DC, just one quick follow-up question on that, on Olympus. Are you seeing other protocols like take advantage of this kind of like own liquidity mechanism?
Yeah, Olympus has a program which is called Olympus Pro, which allows to create bonds for your own tokens within Olympus. So let's say that you're, so one example, you have Alchemix, which is a self-repaying loan protocol, or like it's a protocol that allows users to borrow from the future and repay those loans automatically. And so what they've done is partner with Olympus to purchase their own liquidity on AMMs. So they create this bonding mechanism that allows for users to bond their liquidity for Alchemix into Olympus, and by that get discounted Alchemix tokens. And so that's sort of like the way that other projects are using these kinds of infrastructures. You could spin up your own, but the infrastructure that you'd have to spin up is very complex, and you'd never get the amount of liquidity and usage that Olympus is already getting. And so you could leverage Olympus DAO effectively by either talking to them and through their governance, opening your own liquidity bonding program. So this is one potential option, but I do not know whether Livepeer uses, or whether this model could fit Livepeer's goal long term. It's a question to debate the economics of this.
Yeah, for sure. Super fascinating stuff. Do we have anyone in the audience who wants to ask a question before we close out? DC, thank you so much for coming and sharing, all of your amazing expertise and insight with us. And it's just super valuable, given, where we are in our governance process for the L2 migration with Confluence. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure. Really fun talking about interesting issues that many different protocols are facing.
Absolutely. Cool. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining. We're going to close it down. And as always, follow up in the Discord community governance channels, where we've got links to the forum, where you can also join the longer form discussion there. Thanks, everyone.